Ladies and gentlemen, today is March 4th, 2018, and this is the KNKL Show, episode 365, where we learn to be better artists. My name is Kienan Lafferty, and I would like to welcome you to another show. Today we are going to be talking about backgrounds, and of course, breaking them down into their simplest of building blocks, and we're featuring this futuristic city that I'm creating for my good friend, Jordan Ring, who is an amazing music producer. And of course, you'll look at this piece, and hopefully you have a sense of feeling. You like what this is trying to say to you. You can see a couple characters here, but what I wanted to point out today is that as we strip away these layers of progress, and also I do have a time lapse, which we're going to jump into that right after this. But as we strip away these layers, you can start to see how the scene becomes simpler and simpler until it becomes neo-cubist. No, actually, this is just, I didn't draw this one, or I didn't create this image. This is actually done by my good friend and coworker, Kienan, who's an amazing background artist, and he basically recommended that I try breaking down my scenes into simpler building blocks, because even with something as simple as this, with just these squares and cubes, you can immediately start to get a sense of composition. You can make sure that things are clear, like, hey, we want this character's head in this area to be kind of sticking out over the moon, and using contrast to create silhouettes and shapes. And this is a very, very good way of creating strong reads and strong backgrounds. And it breaks things down into their simplest of forms. And why I want to talk to you guys about this today is because normally I compose my thumbnails and my values like this. And it's okay, but the problem is that this takes much longer to do. And oftentimes I like to break down my pieces into as many steps as possible. I've oftentimes said this, is that the best pieces come out that way because oftentimes the artist knows how to do the right thing at the right time, okay? So one of the faults of this stage, or one of the faults of this type of painting, is that I'll try to compose the picture with lines first. And then what I end up doing is I'll lay the values in behind it. Now this is all right, but I think that the issue begins here. And that is when you want to start really defining these values. Like, see how you can tell that these buildings are back here, but that's because there's still lines there. And based upon like what type of painting we're going to be doing here, or if you want it to be a little bit more realistic, oftentimes I found that lines don't work very well on backgrounds, at least in the case of the style that I like to work in. So I oftentimes run into issues when I try to do this, when I try to mix in line work, like comic book line work, with, say, things that are bright or lights, or really getting that sense of depth in there. So, and of course, these two characters, you're wondering, who are these two mysterious characters? Well, you can see here that we have a scholar, and this is the part that I really enjoy because I really enjoy drawing the characters, getting up close and personal, getting to know them. And then we have our soldier. This is, of course, a modern take on the story, the ancient Japanese story, the Chrysanthemum Veil. And it just so happens that that story is what is inspiring my good friend Jordan to create music for this piece. So, of course, he contacted me and said, Keenan, can we make a piece for this album, for this song? And, of course, I said yes, because my good friend Jordy, I would do anything for him. So let's go ahead and jump into our time lapse. And then, of course, after this, I'm going to show you guys how to do this real time. And I think today should be a little bit of a shorter one. Let me go ahead and get that ready to go. Okay. Today might end up being a bit of a shorter one, but we'll see how it ends up being. Let's go ahead and jump into this time lapse. Boom. Boom. Okay, now this is going to be the beginning of my early style of sketching. And you can see how I immediately start working small. I've taught you guys to work small. Don't ever draw on the entire canvas and try to compose from there. It hurts the mind. You get caught up in details. You can see even myself here, I would argue, looking back at this, I would say that I'm getting way too caught up in the details. And it's good for like laying some things out if this is how you get your mind going. But I highly recommend, ever since I tried this value trick, or like laying in the value building blocks, it really helps to get that sense of feeling in your piece a lot earlier. And I really, really like that. Really, really like that a lot. So I'm going to have this ready to go, ready to fire off that second time lapse as soon as we need to. And yeah, if you're curious about the story, I will tell you a story. Tell you a story about the Chrysanthemum Veil and how the original story goes. So it is indeed about a scholar and a soldier who meet up at this Chrysanthemum Veil. However, or they meet up at the Chrysanthemum Festival. However, earlier, the soldier says that he's going to war, and he presumably dies during that war, but he still appears to the scholar on the eve of the chrysanthemum, under the moonlight of the chrysanthemum festival. And then, sure enough, as the sun rises, his spirit or body turns into vaporwave, right? Because that was a terrible joke. Because Jordan's making it's sort of like an 80s. It's a bit of like an 80s kind of retro outrun style music. So we're wanting to mix those two together. His body turns into a spirit. I tried to say vaporwave. It was a terrible joke. Okay. Anyway, continuing. So you can see here how the scene begins to come together really early on. And immediately, even if you leave, this is what I love about this technique, is that at any point you can begin to say, hey, if I left the piece like this, it still evokes a sense of feeling. And oftentimes I found myself going back to these early iterations and saying that this was stronger. As I added in more detail, sometimes it took away a feeling. And so I would go back. And that's why you can see over here, look, I'm saving all these layers. Saving all these layers is going to be really important for what I'm going to teach you guys today, as we do a more simplified, but albeit real-time version of this. And as far as what that subject is going to be, I have no idea. In fact, the simpler the better, because I oftentimes overcomplicate things. I oftentimes want to get into the details way too early. And if anything, this technique has taught me to keep things simple for as long as possible. And so you can see here, we're getting to the end of our piece. You can see I really struggled with this, really trying to figure out how to get that city in. Like I wanted it to be like the road where the cars are driving along the street. And I ended up just going back to the old version of it, just keeping it, again, very, very simple. So let's go ahead and jump on over to, let's go and close this down. Let's jump on over to where we currently are. And let's go ahead and build it up once more so you can see how this piece progressed. Okay, so you can see that I just ended up going back to, just look at this shape. Like I took away the entire city street before it was like this, but then I was like, oh, I like how simple it was before. And I also liked how, I think the reason that I like this is because I wanted the characters to feel like they were high above the city. Like maybe they were standing on a couple of these buildings, on the tops of these buildings. And for whatever reason, the street just ended up pulling too much of my attention away. I was trying to resolve too many things with perspective in this, which is another thing. I'm trying to create this so that way we can parallax it, much like I taught you guys in the motion comic video. If you haven't seen that, go ahead and check that out. But this is going to be created for a parallax. And so all of the characters need to be on layers so they can move in front of one another, creating that awesome 2.5D illusion. So let's go ahead and, wait, let me make sure that this is on the right camera. Okay, good. Okay, we're good. Haven't done this in a couple weeks, coming back, a little rusty, but it's okay. We're getting this. So let's go ahead and peel back the layers. So you can see right here, one piece, and then right here. And even as early on as this piece, I really liked how we could immediately start figuring out the composition, where the characters are going to be. Things like in comics, you say, okay, we want one character to be the dominant one. We want one character to be really the focal point. And there's a lot of things that are working well for us here. And that is, well, we have this tool called the moon. And that is going to create this really strong silhouette of character 1, aka our soldier. And then you can notice how immediately the character 2, I want it to be not only diminished by taking a lower height on the piece, but then also the difference in the contrast. Look at the building behind him. See how it's like that dark gray? And then it is only contrasted by the darker gray of his body, the darker gray of his silhouette. This means that this character over here, character 2 or scholar, is going to be our second read. And that means that, yes, of course, I can control your mind and you can do the same to your viewers. And I'm going to teach you how to do that the right way, okay? Because this is a bit of black magic and can be a little unethical to control your viewers' minds, but put into the right use, put into the right piece, it can be beneficial and make your viewers feel good. It can make them feel, well, actually, it can make them feel any feeling, actually, and you can control the pace and tell the story yourself. So, enough blabbing, enough philosophical crap. Let's go ahead and get into it. Let's make a new piece. So, of course, we're going to start with our good friend, the blank canvas. I'm sure you're going to open this up and you're going to be like, where do I start? And of course, this is another thing I like about this, is that you can start with a blank canvas, and I'm going to show you how to do it right now. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to ask that you do is pull up a gray, make sure it's neutral. Make sure it's very neutral, meaning that it can't be too light, too dark. Keep it right in the center, right around here, I would say. Let's say that we're going to create a new piece here. We're going to create a new piece, and I'm going to introduce you a new friend, and that is called the lasso tool. And we are going to begin creating a new piece. So let's say that we wanted a piece to be as simple as this. Let's say, well, you know about the 2/3 effect, or the 2/3 compositional theory. What if we created a piece like this? What if we said, okay, we want a compositional piece to be right here? What if we did this? What if we added that in? Now all of a sudden you would say, okay, my attention is pulled over to the right side of the canvas. Now, what can we do with that? Well, we can add a new character in there. I think I'm literally actually ripping off Kienan as I do this. I totally subliminally am ripping you off, Kienan, and I apologize. But this tutorial is too good, and I need to tell it. I need to tell everybody about this. Okay, now within that, we can create a new character. Now I'm just going to do this just for simplicity's sake. We're going to add in a character there. Now, do you see how there's a lot of feeling that is already being conveyed here? That this character is dwarfed by whatever these two things on the side of it are. It could be a canyon. It could be buildings. It could be like a post-apocalyptic setting, right? The fact that it's also diagonal says a lot to our viewers. It says a lot about the setting. Now, let's go ahead. I'm actually really enjoying this. I love how simple this is, and this is why I love this, guys. I love this because you can so quickly play around with composition and start figuring out how things feel. And that's a very important thing to think about, okay? But then here's the next thing, is that we can begin playing around with colors, or actually rather values. We can make the character darker, which leads us to believe, especially if you do this, once you make the character larger and move it closer, this gives us the feeling that the character is close to us, because as things, well, in this case, the background is a light color. So what happens is, as things go further back in space, they will, let's say that we had more characters. As they go back in space, they're going to lighten in value because there is more atmosphere. There's more atmosphere and light bouncing off, right? Okay, I'm going to try my best to explain this in as simple terms as possible, because the first time it was told to me, it confused the heck out of me. But as things go back in space, they are obscured by more of what we call the sky, which is also atmosphere. And so, taking on more of that atmosphere, which in this case is a bright color, our figures will also get bright. Figures will also become brighter. So let's go ahead and, so take a look at this. Now, but also it really helps that we're showing overlap here. Overlap as well as atmosphere distortion are two of the major things that help to start telling about depth. They start communicating depth in your piece. So you can see here, oh, okay, of course this person is closer to us because it's bigger, it's overlapping this person in the back, and there's less atmospheric distortion. Okay, but let's go back to this. Let's go back to this because I really want to talk about this right here. Now, because this figure is the same value as the walls next to it, we can infer that this is about the same, they're about the same distance from one another. But if we lighten this character even further, now do you see how it feels like it's being pushed back in the distance? It's being pushed back in the distance, and now all of a sudden these two figures on the side are more on the foreground, okay? Now, let's continue with this because I think this is a pretty cool idea, and I want to run with this. In fact, I really like that post-apocalyptic setting type thing that we were going for earlier, and I want to elaborate on that. Now, let's go ahead and create some additional concepts or shapes. That was what I was trying to say. Shapes that will, oh my gosh, my cheek is so itchy. It got so itchy all of a sudden. But regardless, I think this is probably one of the best tutorials I've ever given. This is why we do it live. This is why we do it live, because you get to see stuff like this. Okay, so, and make sure you're creating new layers for each of these. And you're going to go ahead and drop that in. Go ahead and drop that in. And then now you can create, or rather play around with the values. This could be rubble. This could be, it actually doesn't really matter what it is just yet. But let's say that I want a shape to be there. And maybe another one right here. Boom. Now all of a sudden we have things that are acting as things to point us to our character, to make it feel like it's dangerous, to make it feel like there's something, maybe this is a dangerous zone, a dragon's lair of sorts. In fact, I'm liking that as well. I'm liking the dragon's lair. So let's go ahead and play around with that. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do is I want a little bit more foreground. I want a little bit of overlap right here. Maybe something like this would do well. Yeah, I'm liking that. I'm liking that. And then maybe some additional things in here. And you can see how I'm just kind of creating these shapes with the lasso tool. By the way that I'm doing this, say you can create one shape and then add a shape to it, I'm just holding the shift key. Holding the shift key allows you to create a shape and then add another shape to it. Okay, so there you go. Boom, easy peasy. Very, very easy. Oh yeah, and you gotta make sure you kind of hug the border if you want to do something like this. Cool, digging that, digging that. Let's create another layer of something even closer, which means we're gonna go even darker value. Maybe something like this. Oh, maybe something like this. That looks pretty good. That looks cool. Digging that. Why does it keep doing that? There we go. And you can see I'm just kind of having fun here. But you can see immediately how we're already creating depth in our piece. Now, there is something else that I'd like to do here. I'd like to add some additional noise behind the character, in this character space. So I'm going to go behind this area right here. And let's say that maybe there are some trees or something back here. Let's go ahead and begin filling in some areas in this area, or filling in some shapes in this area. Yeah. Yeah, that feels cool. And I want it to be behind. Why is it not behind this thing? Oh, that's right, because our background is actually that neutral gray. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to clip it back to this white layer and watch as it automatically goes behind. Isn't that nice? Isn't that fancy? And then I'm going to take our character, and I wonder if I want to make them a little bit darker. See how once I make them darker, it feels like they're inside the cave, but if I do this, it feels like they're outside. I want the character to feel like they're inside the cave. So let's lower the value, or darken the value, to make it feel like they've already entered this cave. Now we can start getting into the fun part, and that is adding a little bit more detail. Now, I'd highly recommend that as you do this, you would use something that is a high opacity brush, very, very opaque, and that doesn't require a lot of wrist strength because you got to save your hand, save your life. And so for this, I recommend something like the ink brush, and it looks like this. So as you draw, see, I can press lightly, and it only affects the width. So that means I don't have to constantly be pressing as hard as possible, because what we're going for here is we're going for just shapes. We want to create only shapes. Now, this is the point where I begin overpainting. In fact, I'll call this value overpaint. This is the difference between, let me go ahead and go back to our original chrysanthemum veil picture here. Chrysanthemum, why do I keep calling it chrysanthemum veil? Whatever, chrysanthemum, it sounds cool. Okay, so this is akin to going from this, or basically going from this to this. See how I'm adding in some additional shapes? I'm beginning to add in detail, but also making sure that it stays as a very graphic read. You can see how this shape, it feels like, oh, that's of course the soldier's handkerchief or the schmog around his neck. It's the reflected light. And even down here, oh, that's reflected light on his leg. But when you really look at it, see how it's just a shape. It's just shape that's added in there. We're focusing on values, And now you can gaze in amazement at how much your brain actually interprets those things. And now you can use that to your advantage with creating this piece. Okay, so I just realized that I want this character, or I want this piece to involve two characters. I want this piece to involve two characters to show, again, that depth. So let's have one character right here, and then the other one is here. But of course, it's going to be shrunk down. It's going to be pushed back in the distance, and it is going to be lightened because we want it to be in the background. Isn't that great? Hey, this is coming along very nicely. I'm going to go ahead and flip this. We have a little bit more contrast, visual contrast going on here. And let's darken down this character. A little bit like that. This foreground stuff needs to be much darker because see how this is on the same plane as the character because of the value? Let's darken it down. Let's move it further towards the foreground. Maybe even move it up a little bit. Oops. Grab that. Move that up a little bit. Stretch it out. Again, because they're just shapes, we can feel free to kind of block things in as we see fit. I'm actually liking that. Actually, I don't know if I like that more. I actually liked it better before. I do like it better that way. Okay, cool. And see how much easier that is? See how we didn't have to redraw the entire character? We can just compose this on the fly. I absolutely love that. Oh, one more thing that I need to get into is gradients. Gradients are another really awesome tool for simulating light. They're going to simulate your light sources and make your life so much easier. Let's go ahead and get into that, shall we? So the first thing that I would argue that we need to put in here is a gradient that comes from the ground and it is being radiated upwards. So let's go ahead and grab our gradient tool here. And let's go ahead and pick this one that fades into nothingness. And I'll show you an alternate version of how you can do this because I tend to not really like the gradient tool. I have a love-hate relationship with it. But regardless, when you get your gradient tool working properly, you can go ahead and lay in stuff like this. Now see how that adds light to our piece. And again, reinforcing more of our scenery, more of our bounce lighting and feeling that we're trying to get in this piece. However, I need to show you the alternate version, which allows you to control it a little bit more. And that is, of course, picking your soft brush. Where's the soft brush? There we go. So go ahead and grab yourself a soft brush. And depending on your CPU speed, this will either work really well or slow your computer the heck down. But see how now you can manually kind of paint it in there. And this could also work for you. If you want something a little bit more procedural, I would say just take your time to get that gradient tool out, bust it out. It can also save a little bit of time. But if you want a little bit more control, then I would say use the soft brush. Okay, so there we go. We got a little bit of our bounce lighting going on in there. And you might ask, Keenan, how did you know that there should be bounce lighting there? This just has to do with simple studies of actual real life. Like, I would highly recommend that you guys take photos or find scenes of movies that you really like and start to break them down into their key components. A great way to do this is to drop it into Photoshop and lower the saturation all the way to black and white, and then begin asking yourself, what lighting tricks are they using here? What compositional tricks are they using here to guide my eye, to guide my eyes? And you will be amazed. You will be freaking amazed. Okay, but that might be another tutorial for another time because we're focusing on our own piece here. I want to add in a little bit of light to these areas, or maybe a little bit more darkness. Yeah, maybe a little bit more darkness here would be cool. Yeah, I like that. And then I'm going to go to this layer right here, the foreground layer, and I'm going to add in a little bit of light. Add in a little bit more light here, see what that does for us. Because this could be spotlighting. This could be like a crevice in the top of the cave that is letting in light to these areas. There's always a reason, right? Always drop in your values, drop in your shapes first, then ask questions later. That's what I always do. Because as an artist, you can basically create the world as you see fit. You can create the world as you see fit. And that makes me oh so happy. You are the god of your art and you can do whatever you like with it. Okay, so the next thing that I'm going to do, we're going to go back to overpainting now because I'm really confident that we can just launch right into this. So now we are painting above everything. We're going to use our ink brush and we're going to continue laying in our values. Okay, so one thing that I really see going well for us here is creating a light or creating a rim light from the outside here. I might want to darken this down just a tad bit. If you feel like your values are a little bit straining on the eyes, go ahead and just drop it down a little bit. Let's go ahead and create some cast shadows after we're done with this rim lighting. So we have this rim lighting, but then we want to make sure that the cast shadow from the character is still being communicated here. So let's have that cast shadow there. Let's maybe have some lines going through here to show perspective. And again, more leading of the eye to where we want the viewer to look. Maybe have some jagged edges in this rock. Maybe some additional foliage outside. Let's see, maybe some lighter versions too. Maybe some lighter things in the back here. Yeah, and see how our picture is beginning to emerge. And this is, mind you, just one option of many that I'm sure you will come into. This is the other piece of advice that I'll recommend to you, is that one thing that I really did like about the early versions of this is that sometimes I do like to work in lines at the beginning and make sure that you find the technique that works well for you. Because sometimes laying out characters like this, just getting the positions down and saying things like, okay, I know that I want a building to be here, and then just laying it out with lines, that might actually work better for some of you. I don't want to show you this and make you think, oh, okay, this is how I should have been doing my scenes the entire time. If I don't do it this way from now on, I'm a failure. No, this is merely just another tool that you can use, another route, you can say, to get to where we're all trying to get. And that is, how do I create a feeling for my viewer? How do I create a piece that evokes mood and tells a story, right? Tells a story. And I think that is what we're all trying to get to in life. So I'm going to go ahead and drop in some additional big shapes. Again, you can see I'm getting in there, and this is the common trap that I run into. I try to get in there, and I'm like, okay, maybe these could be like leaves, and then I go in there and I start trying to I zoom in, and I'm like, okay, let's shade this area, and let's make it into a tree. Let's draw a tree here. But again, don't do that. Don't draw a tree. Simplify it into its most simple form, right? Think neo-cubist. I hope I'm using that term properly. But no, now the tree is it's a square. It's a square, and the leaves are a circle, okay? I want you to begin playing around with things like this. Should the trunk be big enough that it kind of intersects with the character's face here, with the character's head? Does that create a nicer transition? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. In this case, I think it does. Let's zoom out. Yeah, I actually kind of like that. I dig that. Cool. Cool. And then we've got these foreground leaves. Looks great. And I like this. Now I'm all of a sudden starting to see a pattern happening. I really like this zigzag pattern that is forming, like right here, here, down to here. And I want to reinforce that. So let's go ahead and do just that. Let's reinforce it. So boom, boom. Then we're going down here. We're going here. Yeah, and then within here, we'll have some additional shapes like that. Looks great. Looks grand. All right. Digging that very much. Okay, so now we have a background. We have a background going on, and I feel like maybe these need to be lighter here. Yeah, maybe those values need to be a bit lighter. I feel like that gives me the look that I was going for. I'm going to simplify this just a little bit more too. There we go. There we go. Yeah. Digging that a lot. And I hope that this helps you guys out. We're probably going to be finishing this up here in just a moment. But I hope this helps you guys out with your scene setting and lighting as well as composition, and quickly enabling you to ask yourself very important questions such as, does this convey the feeling that I'm wanting to give to my viewer? Does this tell the story that I'm wanting to tell? Am I properly leading my viewer's eyes by use of clever tricks like arrows? We call these arrows, right? Because they're pointing to where I want you to look. Do the values make sense? You know, all those questions can be answered very quickly, as you've seen here. We've done it in just a few, I don't know, we've probably been going for maybe 15, 20 minutes, if I were to guess. And then you can get in there and you can ask yourself, then you can finally get in there and start adding in details. Let's add in just a little bit of detail on one of these characters, because I want to show you how I would do this for a human figure. So the first thing that I do in something like this is I ask myself, okay, what lights are going to be interacting with this character? And first of all, we see this really bright one from the outside, which is of course going to be rim lighting the character. Okay, so let's just go ahead and kind of sketch that in. And I don't want you to worry so much about gesture. I kind of got lucky a little bit with this one, or with my chrysanthemum piece. And sometimes that will happen. Like, see how this guy just has like a natural like swagger to his walk? Wait, where is it? Okay, like see how this guy just has like a natural swagger to his walk? He looks like a GQ like model. I'm like, hey, that's really nice. That happened by complete accident. That actually happened by complete accident. And in fact, I think that I was better set up for that to look good because I had already done this sketch. I was referring to this sketch early on as I was drawing these characters, which I had already figured out a little bit of the anatomy and as well as the posing. Like you can see this character's like looking back as they're walking, and this guy kind of has his hands in his pockets or on his gun as he's walking. So I already had that playing out to my advantage. I don't want you guys to get bogged down in that early on. In fact, if you do want to set yourself up to have a little bit more success on this part of the blocking out phase, where you're now beginning to refine a little bit of the anatomy, I would highly recommend that you do what I did, and draw the character's anatomy and pose first so you kind of know what you're going with. Because if you don't, then it's probably going to look a little bit like what I'm going to show you right here. And that is more shapes. It's going to look more graphic, more designy, more Picasso. I don't know, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, you can see here, we can lay in simple things like this. Like, okay, well, this is where the character's arm will be. And there's going to be, of course, let's say, oh, well, we want a little bit of reflected light on this character. And a little goes a long way. A little goes quite a long way. So you can start laying in shapes like this. And now all of a sudden we have reflected light on the underside of the character. And we can begin like laying in the hair here. Let's say we wanted the character to have pigtails. Why not? You can add in things like that because that is another thing that occupies space that you must be aware of. Something that occupies the space. Okay, and I'm really glad I made that point about not worrying about anatomy at this point because, oh man, that would have been so frustrating for you guys, I bet. If you looked at this, like if you looked at the original Chrysanthemum and you saw it like, oh, my figures need to look like that. Don't do that. In fact, I'm kind of angry at myself that I proposed or that I showed you this, like expecting you to do that. But I'm also glad I pointed it out that I had sketched these poses first and I knew what I was shooting for. So please do that. Please do that and don't get frustrated. Okay. But this might also be a good way. You might actually come up with a pose out of the blue just by messing around with shapes yourself on this. And I don't want to discourage that. I would say play around and figure out what works best for you. It sounds so cheesy to say it that way, but that's what I'm saying. In fact, one thing I will say is that break things down into their simplest form. I want this character to be entering the cave. So instead of looking inside, I want them to be looking upwards. I want them to be looking at, say, like the jagged edges of these rocks that are pointing down. Any one of these could come breaking loose at any moment and come and impale them in the face, and that would not be good. So of course they're going to be kind of looking up that way and maybe shielding themselves from the sunlight that's coming from behind them. Okay, so we can have, of course, like maybe some hot light kind of right here to show that, oh, okay, this light or the sunlight is kind of coming from this direction. And maybe something like this could work. Cool. Liking that. Digging that. And I would totally, yes, again, just trying to wing this anatomy on the fly. And I'm getting bogged down into details. I'm really glad you guys can see this live because this tells so much. This is another reason why I love doing it live, guys, is because you can see my struggles. You can see the things that I'm messing up on, and you can see the things that I would go back in later and say, okay, we really need to figure out what this pose is. We need to figure out this character. This head is too big. This looks like Frankenstein over here. What are we thinking? But that is all completely natural for you to go through in this phase, okay? But regardless, we have here something that looks quite nice, and I'm very happy with it. Very, very happy with it. And I think we're well on our way to an interesting piece. We are well on our way to an interesting piece of these characters entering a cave. And we have a lot of things that are already working well to our favor because we started with values. We started with building blocks. We started with simplicity. And now we can take all those things that we learned with us into the next stage. And that could be either going in there and drawing, maybe figuring out the anatomy, figuring out the posing, figuring out the exact faces that will be on these characters. You can see all this stuff was already prepared before I did it. And if this wasn't done at this point, then I would say that the next step would be, yes, go in and figure out what these characters look like. Go in and draw them, figuring out what their costumes are going to look like, because that is also going to be really important when you start laying in, because this costume had already been done. See, I knew that he had a handkerchief. So I knew that that was something that I had to represent in this value study, in this area. And sometimes you can notice how I only drew basically the bust of this character. I don't know what he looks like from the chest down. So sometimes having a little bit of that knowledge and carrying it over to the value stage, you can also begin to resolve a few things. Like I put in these shapes here, which could say, or which could be like an ammo belt. This could be like the shells of his ammo belt right here on this part right here. And then also like a little bit more of like this belt, or there's an ammo belt and then his actual belt right here. And then I also like drew in the gun. It's like, and then this little piece is kind of sticking out. It's like, oh, maybe that could be like a bipod or something. But those types of ideas can come to you also in the value stage. So both techniques will complement each other and help you get closer to your final goal. But nothing comes close to getting your feeling across and laying in an early background, or figuring out your early lights and your early composition, and selling a feeling as much as this technique does. This technique knocks it out of the park. I would highly recommend that you always do this whenever you're laying together a scene. Oh, and I totally forgot about the last cool thing that you can do, and that is, of course, bloom. Bloom is a really awesome thing that basically creates shines, or it creates really, really blown out light. It creates blown out light and allows you to create another photo effect. It's kind of like a gradient. Think of it as a gradient that spills over from very, very bright lights. And you can also come in here and begin doing things like that. And you can even add in things like fog. Let's say, oh, I want fog to be in this area. You can do that by adding in these gradients. And you can kind of even adjust and determine the shape of this fog with the soft brush. So you can do things like this. Now all of a sudden you have a foggy, musty, scary looking cave that the characters are entering. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm actually really happy with how that went. We're going to go ahead and end today's tutorial. And of course, yeah, if you're curious about dissecting all these layers for yourself, I will be putting this on the Patreon along with all of the other PSDs that have ever been featured on the show. Hint, hint, there's over 100 of them. You can download all of them today if you pledge on Patreon. Thank you guys so much for everyone who has been supporting. I love you guys. And yeah, that's enough shameless plugging. But yes, I would like to say thank you guys so much for joining me on YouTube. Thumbs up if you like it, thumbs down if you don't. My name is Kienan Lafferty. I'll see you guys next week. I'm going to leave you with some lovely laying. I hope you got some good value out of this. And of course, that's a great pun. Hope you got some great value out of this. And yeah, try this out for yourself. I would love to see some of your own takes on building scenes like this and keeping them simple as much as possible. Don't worry about anatomy. Don't worry about any of that stuff. Don't worry about trying to show off. Actually, go ahead and show off. I know you guys like to do that. You guys are so cool with your freaking stuff on the Lovely Lane on the Instagram. You always impress me. And speaking of that, that's a perfect segue into it. So you guys take care. I will see you next week. Until then, I will treat you with, speaking of music, my good friend Jordy created this music. And I asked him if he would be so kind as to let me use it at the end of my episode. Because as we go into, we like to go into Instagram. And the previous song was ending way too early, so I asked him if I could use one of his songs. So this is by Jordan Ring. If you like his stuff, please check out his YouTube. I will link it somewhere in the description. Maybe it'll pop up at the left side, top right side, somewhere. Go check him out. Till next time, take care.